Hello. I should say welcome to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, but it will be very, very inappropriate since I'm brand new. And so many of you here have not only been with the council for many, many years, you've built the council, you've sustained the council, you've made pretty much everything that we do possible. So I will start instead by saying thank you to those who are joining us tonight. And thank you to all of you who have made the council 103 years old, an extraordinary place that I jumped and leapt at the opportunity to move across the pond, back across the pond to lead. So thanks for being here tonight. Thanks to all of you who are online, and thanks especially to you who made the effort to be here in person. It's never easy on a very hot and very muggy summer day. We're on the record tonight, just so you know. I started my role here on July 1st. Our panel today, the Middle East on Edge, I did choose the topic. I am not a scholar of the Middle East. I am a scholar and a sort of policy person of international affairs, and one cannot avoid, and one doesn't wish to avoid the Middle East. But I started my role 6 days after President Trump declared that he had negotiated a ceasefire between Iran and Israel. And at the end of a 12-day war, which, just to remind us of what we all know, on June 12th, Israel struck Iran. In total, and I'm sure I'll get corrections, over the course of those 12 days, 30 commanders and 19 nuclear scientists were killed. There's a discussion to be had about the impact on Iran's nuclear capabilities. On June 22nd, the U.S. used military force to strike 3 nuclear sites in Iran. And two days later, we get a ceasefire, which at the moment remains in place. And President Trump has said he's in Scotland. And he has said that if Iran returns to its decision to, and then there's sort of a question about what? It's a little bit vague intentionally. Diplomacy is often vague. If it returns to maybe enrichment, maybe something else, that America will use force again. This is an extraordinary moment. Many of us in this space have watched the debate about whether the United States should use military force to rid Iran of its nuclear capabilities. We've watched the debate for many, many, many years. So to suddenly see it come into play meant to me that this was exactly the right topic to begin to return to, at least for me, the first public program on this event. And the second thing I would say before I quickly introduce some tremendous speakers is that there are very few cities in the world that have the depth of expertise in international affairs, in public policy, and on the Middle East as Chicago. So I feel very proud and very excited that we have 2 globally recognized scholars of the Middle East and international relations, one absolute leader in the field of public policy and think tanks who is deeply and broadly known for his research on Iran, who is not from Chicago. But I think the goal is to bring together local and global and national expertise to really interrogate these questions. So we have 3 terrific people. 2 of them are very well known to you, so my introductions will be super brief. Dr. Rachel Bronson, who until recently was CEO for 10 years of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. I've known Rachel since we were in grad school at Columbia University together. I won't say how long ago that was. It was not recently. She has written extensively on many things, but is well known for her book, Thicker Than Oil, which is about the U.S.-Saudi relationship. Professor Bob Pape from the University of Chicago. Everybody knows you, Bob, and not only in Chicago, certainly for your work on the fallacy of thinking that you can bomb from the air to solve really important and complicated problems on the ground. You've also recently written a pretty, I don't know if you chose the title, but it has a big title. You wrote it after Israel's strike and before America's strike during those 12 days, Israel's futile war. So there's a headline perhaps for where this conversation is going. Ali, you're director of the Iran Project at the International Crisis Group, one of the best, I don't know if you call it advocacy organization, think tank, but best research in the field. You've worked at the UN. We all know your work. So let me start us off. There are a lot of different baselines that different audiences and different people might choose. For some people, it is 1979. For some people, it is the JCPOA. For some people, it is President Trump's decision to withdraw from the JCPOA in 2018. For some people, it's October 7th. There are many, many other baselines against which we are evaluating the current moment that we're in. But I think it's important to remind ourselves that we didn't start with a 12-day war. So let me start with you, Rachel, and the question of the ceasefire. So we have a ceasefire. It seems to be holding at this point in time. We know that ceasefires frequently don't last if they don't resolve the most important underlying issues. What do you make of, and I will pose this to all three of you actually, what do you make of the ceasefire?
Well, thank you. Delighted to be here. Delighted to be here in your inaugural program. What a thrill and honor, truly. You set us up really well, and I want to get to that ceasefire, which I think will hold. Those are, kind of as soon as you say that, I'm sure something just happened. But the reason I think it will hold is because the Israeli attack was so consequential that I think Iran is taking this time to figure out who its allies are and where they are and what they will offer. So we know that a number of senior Iranians have headed to Russia, have been speaking with the Chinese. They've gotten very polite responses, thank you for coming kind of responses, but nothing to suggest that they're going to have enormous support and bolster them to take on some kind of new, it's conventional fight. So I think that's one. I think maybe even more importantly is the Israeli attack demonstrated such significant penetration of Iranian forces and movements. Their intelligence is the Israeli intelligence is so considerable that the Iranians have to spend considerable time just trying to figure out where those holes are. And we know that they've been rounding up hundreds and really more than 1,000 people to try to figure out where those holes in intelligence are. So now is not the movement to be moving because I think they would assume that the Israelis are watching and already know what they might do. That doesn't mean that they're completely flat-footed and aren't going to do something. So we know that there's been Houthi strikes, the Yemeni strikes of Israel again, as recently as in the last 24 hours. And that's an Iranian message that they're still around. But in terms of the ceasefire more broadly, I think particular for the Iranians, they kind of have to be in a, not wait and see, but wait and just figure out what their calculations are of how they could even respond. So I'll stop there, but I do hope we can come back to when did this start?
Yeah, okay, absolutely. Professor Pape.
Thank you
Pape.
for having me here. Thank you for having me part of this august panel. And Leslie, thank you for being our leader. We are so lucky to have this woman. Thank you very much. So my baseline goes back to 2002. That's the year that we first discovered there was going to be this thing called Natanz, this deeply buried bunker. Now, I've been studying every air campaign since World War I. That's what my book, Bombing to Win, is about. I've taught for the U.S. Air Force, conventional targeting strategy. But I started teaching at the University of Chicago in 1999. 2002 comes, and I'm teaching my class on strategy. And as my students who are in the back know, at the end of every year's class, and starting in 2003, we have a hypothetical bombing of Iran's nuclear program. And every single year we've been doing that. And the last time we just spent this 90 minutes going through all of the details was May 22nd. So literally 3 weeks before. So if you go to my Twitter, my X account, you'll see tons of things about that because I just literally come with all the PowerPoint presentations. Now, what is the big thing? How can we summarize this quickly? I think the big number, folks, you should focus on is the number 408. 408. Iran had, at the end of May, 408 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. That was the core concern. They had 20%, they had 5%, but that 408 is what they need, what the 60%. They were only weeks away of moving that up to 90%. That 408 was the equivalent of 10 nuclear bombs. 10. And the estimates were they were somewhere between 5 and 8 months away. You'd have to enrich, you'd have to formulate it and to assemble the bombs and so forth. Well, where is that 408 today? We don't know. And that was always the core conclusion of every single one of those hypothetical bombing scenarios that we did. We would take out, with exquisite precision, every building standing above ground. Well, we pretty much did that. We would also take out, through what I called double tap attacks, that was my name for it, it wasn't even called a name 20 years ago, where GPS, the thing you need to know about GPS, folks, is it's three-dimensional. It's not just two-dimensional the way it is on your phone. So if the first bomb creates a crater, the second bomb can target that depth, another, and the third can maybe penetrate all the way through into those hulls. Well, the fundamental problem we were always going to face, that word futile, was we would never be able to verify that 408. And in this case, it's actually worse, because in the intervening time between the time Israel started the bombing and the United States bombed Fordo and Natanz, we know through satellite imagery, civilian satellite imagery, which is now exquisite, that there were trucks taking stuff out from Fordo. Now, we could hope they were changing light bulbs. Do you really think that's what they were doing? Okay, maybe they're changing light bulbs, but we don't know. And that uncertainty, folks, is going to basically drive us nuts with each passing month that goes by. It's already been a month. Where is that 408? We were saying, they're going to negotiate. We're so tough. We showed them this time, right? Where is the 408? I think we're going to be asking that question until, God forbid, we find out in a way we're not going to like. So that 408 is the thing you should keep your eye on. It was always the issue with a bombing campaign, and it's pretty much right where we're at.
Thank you. Okay, a lot on the table there. Ali, you've studied Iran for a very long time. What is your assessment, I guess, starting with this question of the ceasefire? Bob's moved us directly into kind of, what effect the strikes have actually had on Iran's nuclear capabilities.
Well, first of all, Rachel, let me also congratulate you on taking on the leadership here, and thank you for inviting me for your inaugural event. It's a great pleasure to be in Chicago and be on a panel with Richard and Bob, that are the two people that I've admired for years and years. Look, to answer your question, I think the reason the ceasefire is holding is that all sides have a victory narrative, right? The U.S. can say, we went in with our B-2s, we finished the job. The president says, we obliterated the program, not just damaged it, destroyed it. The U.S. has its own narrative. Israel has its own narrative that it decapitated the Iranian military, that it basically destroyed half of Iran's ballistic missile arsenal and about half of its launchers as well. It also obviously set back and retarded Iran's nuclear program. Iranians have a victory narrative too, if you look at the domestic rhetoric. It's all about how the regime survived, basically. 2 nuclear weapon states attacked Iran, and yet this regime not only remained on its feet, it managed to counterattack in a way that we haven't seen this kind of destruction in Israel since 1973. So everybody has a narrative of victory. The problem is that every narrative of victory also has serious holes in it. As Bob was saying, in the case of the US, the program is damaged, but it's not destroyed. If you wanted to have a breakout scenario, which means that you will use declared nuclear facilities to dash towards nuclear weapons, yes, that program is destroyed, and putting it back together is going to take a long time. But if you want a small footprint, a program that is dedicated towards weaponization, for which you only need 200 of Iran's advanced centrifuges. They had a stockpile of hundreds of advanced centrifuges, which were not in any of the sites we bombed. They have the 408 kilograms of HEU, right, near bomb grade. They can have enough material with 200 centrifuges and that stockpile for a single nuclear weapon in 10 days. Yes, then they need to weaponize, and we don't know how long that would take. But again, they know how to do it. And because the program went from transparency to translucency to opacity, full opacity now, we wouldn't know for sure, right? So there are serious risks there. Israel's narrative of victory, I think, is also problematic because we now know that the scale of damage was much broader than initially reported. And Israel was running out of interceptors. In fact, we used 1/4 of the interceptors that the US has ever produced in this war. Now imagine if this would have continued for another 2 weeks, for another 2 months. And on top of that, you would have China take over Taiwan. Like, what would happen then, right? So there are serious risks here. And there's also the risk of regional conflagration, which Iran's performative, symbolic retaliation against the U.S. by targeting the U.S.-based Al-Udeid in Doha demonstrated. It was not aimed at escalating. It was aimed to be an off-ramp, but it crossed a new line. It attacked for the first time a Gulf country, meaning and signaling to the U.S. that your interests of your allies in the region could come at risk if this continues. And finally, Rachel was absolutely right that Iran is still reeling from the surprise attack. It is indecisive. It doesn't know how to basically put its house in order, plug the security loopholes. And it has significantly been weakened. There's no doubt about it. But the reason I'm worried is that some of the fundamental problems here have not been resolved. And there's a clock that is ticking. And that clock is related to the 2015 nuclear deal. The resolution, the UN Security Council resolution that endorsed it, will expire in October. And the European powers who were signatories to the agreement have said that unless there is some sort of a deal, in fact, they want IAEA access to be restored, the missing nuclear material to be accounted for, and Iran to come back to the negotiating table with the US in order to put more time on the clock. But they have said if that doesn't happen, they will snap back the UN sanctions. Iran has said if that happens, it would withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, being the second country after North Korea to do that. So there's already that clock ticking. And in fact, if the Iranians start to dig out the fissile material, I think that would be a trigger for Israeli strikes again.
So there's a whole lot on the table, and it does seem like a situation which no state's interests are actually being met at the moment. And so therefore, it must be a highly unstable situation at some level. I guess, Rachel, let me come back to you to perhaps, I know you want to talk about the baseline, so I would like to hear your answer to that. Where do we start? But it's a bit of a red herring. So could you also talk to Israel? What is Israel's interest in this right now? Where do you see its policy going? Can Israel achieve security through this strategy? I was reading something earlier today that said that at the moment, Israel's in a position where it basically needs to be ready to strike again, needs to be ready indefinitely to strike again for a very long period of time successfully against Iran. What is your assessment?
Yeah, I think Israel's in militarily one of the strongest positions it's been in since 1967. And I think the United States is as well. I do think that campaign was a resounding success. And I think it's really important to say that. It's a question of, win the battle, what do you do with the war? But for this campaign, it was successful beyond belief. And David Ignatius had a great piece in the Washington Post that Iran's nuclear program is shattered. So we might not like the word obliterated, and anything the president says on that, everyone points out like, it's not exactly that, but like it's shattered. And the material is missing, but what the part that kind of I'm never sure what to do with is Israeli intelligence is all over Iran. They saw those convoys, those trucks moving. If they don't know what's in there, they're going to assume that they're smuggling out nuclear material, and I'm sure they know where they went. And there's a very high likelihood that a lot of it is actually buried. And if the Iranians go digging for it, the Israelis will strike them. And they will have full support from Europeans and the Americans to do so. So I think from an Israeli perspective, the fact that they're still in conflict with Iran, right, suggests that it's not an unmitigated victory, I suppose. But given that Israel is fighting a regime that has been very clear that it is seeking its destruction, that it was moving very quickly in expanding its enriched uranium beyond anything that was needed for civilian purposes, that they have set them back a year or two, which I've seen many commentators poo-poo, is highly significant. Because Iran now has some real choices to make. And this gets back to the earlier question of when did this start? And I think it's important for we in the room, my view on this is when the United States pulled out of the Iran deal, the JCPOA, there was a direct line to military strikes. That when we pulled the diplomatic rug out from under the Iranians.
And the Europeans.
When we weakened those who were seeking a different path, we empowered the hardliners who were committed to this nuclear program. We gave them all of the evidence they needed that we were not serious about it. But they then chose a very, very aggressive enrichment strategy, which they did not need to do. And the Israelis took it out with American help and set them back at least a year or two. And I suspect much longer, given the totality of the response, that we took out not only the missiles, but their delivery systems, the scientists, which are very important to this, and as well as we penetrated, their intelligence was penetrated. So I think it was a resounding successful military campaign. How that lines up then kind of into a more diplomatic solution, I don't think anyone sees a path right now towards that. And therefore, militarily, that's what the tool they had.
So, Bob, I want you to respond to that. But I will say that Rachel and Bob and I were in a meeting that was held under the Chatham House rule just last week. And somebody in the meeting, whose name cannot be said because it was not for attribution, posed a very challenging intervention. And that person said Iran was complying with it was sort of on board the broader agenda, the deal, and that the strikes were an illegal attack and war of aggression on Iran. Okay? This was not my question, but this was a very incisive question that was put to the room. So with that on the table also, can you give us your response?
Yeah, so let's go to a different year, 2015. In 2015, just before the deal, the nuclear deal, Iran had approximately enough material, 5%, 20% enriched uranium, for somewhere between 4 or 5 bombs in about 12 or 15 months if they really pushed their pedal to the metal. Then after the deal, when the deal was signed, it wasn't just to freeze the program. All of the 20% was lifted out, went to Russia. The 5%, most of it all completely gone, and the rest of it basically frozen until we withdrew in 2018. Then when we withdrew under President Trump on May 8th, 2018, what happened is it took a whole year before things started to change, just as we were assuming from that nuclear deal. Things would take a while to ramp up. But then in a year later, they ramped up and they started to build all of those numbers. And then on November 5th, and the reason we know these dates is because of the IAEA reports, the day of the election, it appears, they really ramped it up. over the last 6 months. That's how they got to that number 408 by the end of May. So what they have been seeing is basically they have been seeing that this was coming. That is a possible attack. And also they did this under the NPT. Nothing that I just laid out for you is a violation of the NPT. Now, you might think the NPT should have more strict rules, but it does not have more strict rules. And then on the 13th of June, Israel, just as the Trump administration and the Iranians were about to negotiate, and their negotiations were going just a few days later, that's when Iran struck a bolt from the blue surprise attack, killing some of the people apparently who were going to go to those negotiations just in the next day. So this is where the situation has created. So that's why the ceasefire is so dicey. But folks, the real problem that we face going forward is the uncertainty going forward. So Rachel says, well, okay, let's assume X, Y, or Z. The problem is with each passing week, each passing month, the range of possible outcomes of what can be going on with that 408 is going to widen. Now, are we going to calmly say, oh, sure, that's absolutely fine that we don't have inspectors in there on the ground, and we'll just trust their secret intelligence that's all making, well, we tried that with Saddam Hussein for a decade, and all we did was go berserk because the uncertainty essentially made us get more fearful, until even open-ended inspections on the ground wasn't enough to tell us that Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction. So I'm not worried about what's going to happen in really the next month. I'm more worried what's going to happen starting in the fall, starting in the spring. I teach again in the spring. So I'm looking about that's the time I'm really concerned. And you might say, well, we bought a few months here or there. I'm looking at Israel's security 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Is this going to be stronger? I don't think we've moved that needle in that 12-day war, not for Israel's good.
So, Ali, in your view, what should the balance be? Not balance is sort of the wrong word, but what should the mix be between the threat to use force or possibly the use of force again and diplomacy? And not only what it should be, but where do you see the momentum? And I know that you clearly think a lot about the region. You might want to say a little bit about the Gulf Arab states and their role in this.
Sure. So let me first start by pushing back a bit against what Rachel said, because I think this whole concept of we've set their program back by a year or two is quite interesting to me, because I live in Washington, which, as you know, is an island surrounded by reality.
It's a swamp.
And we're all so proud that we've set back the program by a year or two. The JCPOA set back the program by 15 years. And people in Congress were saying this is not good enough. It's too short. 15 years is nothing. And now we're all proud that, yes, 1 or 2 years was gained without knowing where the highly enriched nuclear material is. And again, Iran has a pathway to a bomb. It does exist. Now, of course, you can say, as Israelis say, you can go back and mow the grass, right? You can go back and bomb again if there is intelligence. The problem with intelligence is when you do such an spectacular, extraordinary kind of attack, right? The Red Wedding, which was dubbed the name of the operation that killed 30 IRGC generals. You also burn your cards. You can't do that again immediately. It took a long time for Israel after the defeat or the draw in 2006 with Hezbollah to get to a stage that it could, put the seeds in the ground to do the pager operation in 2024 that really brought Hezbollah to its knees. These things don't happen repeatedly every month, right? It's not easy. And again, you can't, my concern now is that we're very susceptible, and the Israelis are too, to hubris, to thinking that if we do this again, it will be as low cost as what happened in this round, that Iran was taken by surprise. and that it will be as successful if it's repeated again and again. And one thing that I think everybody in this room should think about is the question of capability versus intention, right? Yes, we reduced Iran's capabilities, and again, industrial scale enrichment capabilities, not weaponization capabilities. That capability is still there. There were 3,000 people working just in the Isfahan facility. Killing 14 people is not enough. In interviews we had with Israeli officials in April, they were saying that their target list of Iranian nuclear scientists that absolutely have to be eliminated to make sure that there is no pathway to nuclear weapons was 45. They killed only 12, 13. So there is still a lot to do if they really want to finish the job. But just to say the pathway to bomb is there, and Iran now has the motivation. At the popular level, at the political elite level, everybody's talking about the fact that we're defenseless. We don't have an air force. Iranian air force dates back from the time of the Shah. It's basically an air force museum. It's not an air force. Its ballistic missiles demonstrated their limits. Their regional network has been destroyed. So there are a lot of people who actually, ordinary people who hate the regime, want Iran to have nuclear weapons to protect the country, right? So the motivation is there more than ever, and that's a dangerous thing. Now, GCC countries are in an interesting position because on the one hand, when the president was in the region in May, every leader he met asked him to do a deal with Iran because they were afraid of precisely this kind of scenario in which a new red line will be crossed and that they could become collateral damage in a fight between Iran and the United States. Now, on the one hand, you can say, well, this attack in Qatar was symbolic and nothing really happened. We could get away with it, they could get away with it, and Iran has been weakened, and that's a good thing for them. But they think a little bit more long-term than we do. So their problem is, what happens if Iran actually becomes North Korea? Either an impoverished state, radicalized state that develops nuclear weapon, or becomes Iraq 1991, post-First Gulf War, a country that is shattered and eventually descends into some sort of chaos and disarray that will be very difficult to put back together. A country of 90 million right next to you, in chaos, very problematic. The second problem they have is, again, what Rachel mentioned, that Israel seems to have no bound in what it wants to do. It can attack at will, anywhere, with impunity, doesn't respect international norms, and Israeli hegemony is as problematic for the Gulf states as Iranian hegemony would have been. So they are in a tough spot, and I think they want to be part of the solution. And this is why, talking about solutions, this idea of doing enrichment as part of a consortium that the regional countries, Gulf countries, are involved in, I still believe is one of the best ways of resolving this problem.
Something I know you're thinking about a lot. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I am. And if I can just push back a little bit on my esteemed colleagues to my right.
And then I'm going to take us signaling. I'm going to take us to the U.S. interest before I open it up to the audience.
I just want to make sure that we're not setting up kind of this false reality, which is of Israel in a region watching a very kind of friendly Iran who is doing nothing to threaten its existence and therefore struck out of the blue in a way that kind of against international norms. Because the reality of the situation is that certainly since October 7th and well before, Israel was under daily attacks from Iran's proxies. And Iran had been building that up for decades, really. And we can go back to the history of when that all started. But Hezbollah and oddly Hamas that it was supporting, as well as the Houthis and this ring of fire that they were creating around the Israelis has been the strategy of the Iranians. My work had been on Saudi, and they created rings of fire around Saudi. And so this was a very extreme and violent situation where the Iranians could have pulled back and didn't. And then not only that, continued an aggressive push of its nuclear program at a time where arms control experts have said they could have stayed at that 60%, the amount they have. But as you said, they doubled down on what they were producing. Every signal they were sending was actually quite significant towards the Israelis and very aggressive. And so I'm not quite sure that I would agree that it's against international norms, the kind of strike which was so directly targeted on its nuclear program. It went after more centrifuges perhaps than it needed, but it went after centrifuges, nuclear scientists, nuclear delivery systems, nuclear facilities, the ability to turn nuclear weapons into nuclear material into weapons. It was very targeted. And when they began to move beyond international norms, began to target the regime, surprisingly, it was the Americans that pulled them back, and did so in a way that many Israeli military observers were thankful for, because it was starting to move into mission creep, where they had so much success that there seemed to be a push to actually overthrow the regime, which would have been against international norms. But up until that point, and pretty much of what they did seems to me quite within the understanding of military norms. It's just they haven't done that for many years, and the U.S. So all of that to say is, we shouldn't make it sound like it was just a bolt from the blue and unexpected. This was a very, very unstable and very dangerous moment. Where I do agree with Ali, and what I find quite fascinating, is these ideas that are actually emerging in the Middle East of how you could advance a peaceful nuclear program. And the Emiratis have been building civilian nuclear power in part for their own energy needs, but also as a demonstration to the Iranians that there is a way to do this peacefully that doesn't bring the international community, the full force of it, against it. And the Emiratis have been building their nuclear power programs, and that's what attracted this huge data center announced in May of 2025. The Saudis, I think very interestingly, are considering this energy regional bank to provide nuclear materials to the neighbors. The Russians do not want to see enrichment, active enrichment programs that risk proliferation. That's something that we actually share interest in. So there's some very interesting and positive developments actually happening to the west of Iran as a demonstration of choices they could make that would ensure that they don't become North Korea, which I don't think they have any interest in becoming.
Thank you. Okay, before we open it up to the audience, sort of maybe some fairly succinct but incisive comments from each of you. I'll start with you, Professor Pape, Bob Pape, on America's interests.
So I think
is America winning, losing? Has this helped America execute on its, Trump's grand strategy or his sort of vision for how America should use and deploy its power?
Well, I loved President Trump's idea that he was going to stop the war in Ukraine, stop the war in Gaza. And I've got to tell you, I'm disappointed that not only are those going full bore, but we've now opened up another front with Iran on top of that for the United States, because we're now directly involved. And that's a real problem, folks, because as we, right now, what I'm just standing up at my center, the Chicago Project on Security and Threats, is a whole new effort to study Al-Qaeda, ISIS, propaganda, Telegram, to look for how terrorist groups and their followers are responding to these events. Why am I doing that? Because it's not just state-sponsored terrorism that's a problem here. This is not whether Iran has a direct puppet to control these terrorist groups. It is whether or not, as we go forward and basically see the rising hegemony of Israel and then military power of Israel being used at will the rest of the region, it's called the Street, that is the 400 million Shia and Muslims in the region, will they just sit back and say, oh, sure, that's okay? So I'm now going to invest in that, looking for donors, by the way. And so we are going to look at this very, very closely. And this is a problem for the United States. This is a problem for all of us traveling around the world. Because this is when you say the interest of the United States, we just told we don't have to take our shoes off anymore. Isn't that a wonderful thing? Well, it's only going to take one airplane coming down in anger for this to change real quick. And this is the biggest problem for the United States. If I could just say one more quick thing. I just published a piece in the Chicago Tribune about how to jumpstart negotiations. I think we need mutual restraint. And the biggest place to start is where you might think it would be the easiest, because it would never happen, which is a limited no first use among Israel, the United States, and Iran over the Iran dispute. If all three countries would promise they would not be the first to use nuclear weapons in this limited situation, I think this may be helpful. And the reason is because we don't think Israel's about to drop a nuclear weapon on Tehran tomorrow. Well, but are they willing to actually say this? And if not, if they're not willing to go that far, if the Americans aren't willing to go that far, and if the Iranians aren't willing to go that far, I think this whole negotiation track's not going to happen.
Thank you. I'm very skeptical, but I really appreciate that intervention. Ali, your comment on the U.S., and then I'm going to turn right to all of you for questions. But is the U.S. achieving its interests? Has it served the U.S. the last 12 plus days?
So again, as I said, if you think about the objectives, if the objective was to block the pathway to a nuclear weapon, that objective has not been achieved. And from this point on, we will have to rely on intelligence, which will be less than perfect, in order to make sure that Iran doesn't dash towards nuclear weapons. If the objective was regime change, it hasn't happened. If the objective was completely neutering Iran so that it doesn't pose a threat either to Israel or to the US, that objective hasn't been achieved. The interceptors alone did cost about $2 billion. And again, what's the achievement? It's a temporary setback of Iran's nuclear program. And by the way, I'm very skeptical of all of these narratives. Last year in October, Israel targeted, when it retaliated for Iranian attack, it targeted one of the mixers that Iran was using to produce solid fuel for its ballistic missiles. And we were told at that time, it was publicly said by Israel, that we have set back Iran's ballistic missile program. Now we are told that the reason Israel took preemptive action was not because Iran was actually on the verge of weaponizing its nuclear capability. It was because it was significantly expanding its ballistic missile program in a way that it would have a North Korea option as well, to be able to destroy Seoul with conventional capabilities, that it was increasing its ballistic missiles to 8,000, whereas we were told just a few months ago that they can't produce as many missiles as was the case in the past. So I'm very skeptical of all of these narratives. The main question is, now that Israel is clearly very capable but still highly dependent on the United States, Iran is in one of the weakest positions that it has ever been, would the president have the focus, the discipline, the desire to find a mutually acceptable solution in which Iran is also able to save face? Because that's the only kind of deal that could last, right? Unfair deals beget unfaithful deal makers.
Thank you for that, because you brought us right back at some level to the very first question that we opened with it. But it's very powerful. There's not agreement. There's not intended to be agreement. Thank you for disagreeing. But I'll come right to the audience. Now, this is where I'm so disadvantaged, because I've gone from really knowing the audience to not knowing the audience at all. So this is going to be quite random. Please, I do know you, which is wonderful. That woman right here, yes. And somebody's going to bring you a mic. Porter's going to bring you a mic. So you say your name and your question.
And thank you all for a fabulous presentation. My question is, do any of you think that the regime is vulnerable to being overthrown from within?
I think that if there was any vulnerability, doing the bombing has strengthened the regime. So since World War I, air power advocates have been arguing they could destroy governments, topple governments from the air alone. Since World War I, that's over 100 years ago, we're still waiting for that first case. Okay, so we've done this over and over and over again. You heard Prime Minister Netanyahu say this was one of his core objectives. This was going to crack the regime. This is what a lot of leaders have said in World War I, Churchill, I mean, all the way through for over 100 years. And there's just no history of this working out. In fact, it's the opposite. The opposite happens when you bomb from the air. What you do is stiffen. You get a rally around the flag effect. That's what you're seeing in the streets right now in Iran. You're seeing nationalist support in addition to the religious support for the regime. That's what's growing inside of Iran. That's why usually, if you really want to topple that regime, ground forces.
Anything to add to this, Ali?
If I may, the Islamic Republic is a very, very unpopular regime. There's no doubt about it. The majority of the Iranian people want to see the back of this regime. The problem is that there is no viable, organized, disciplined alternative available either inside or outside of the country. And, just about 4 decades ago, the Iranian people went through the same experience of radical change, knowing exactly what they didn't want, but not knowing what they wanted. And in fact, their situation was exacerbated as a result of that radical change. So this is why, yes, there is I would call it rally around the soil effect, because the flag it would be very much disputed, but Iranians are fiercely nationalistic. And Israel certainly doesn't have the credibility of being seen as a liberator, or the United States for that matter. And that's why I think this regime is unlikely to be toppled anytime soon. The likelier possibility of some sort of metamorphosis internally, with the clerical establishment more and more losing power to the Revolutionary Guards, and Iran basically becoming a form of military dictatorship instead of a theocracy, somewhere between Pakistan and Egypt. And again, the difference there being whether they have nuclear weapons or not.
Wow. Okay, right here. Again, if you say your name.
My name is Eric Mao. I run the Geopolitical Forum. Continuing on Jane's question about I'm very interested in the power structure in Iran. And I think it's safe to say that although it's very hard because of nationalism stimulated by this attack, the war, but I think it's safe to say that U.S. and Israel will not relent in regime change. So I would like to know more about the power structure in Iran, see what kind of crack that can be exploited for the purpose of regime change, whether it's a religious sect or ethnic groups like Azerbaijani, they're established in Iran.
Thank you.
It used to be that the Persians are friendly with Israel, but now it's Azerbaijan. So what can be exploited if the regime change is attempted?
Thank you so much. We're going to take the gentleman we're going to take a couple, if that's okay.
That's
just
at
the other end of the aisle. Sorry, that's not very easy. Tria. Oh, please. Yeah, go ahead. Please, Tria.
I'll
Sorry.
ask 3 rapid-fire questions, and then you can choose whichever you want to answer.
One.
Just one?
Sorry, one.
Okay, so I'll ask this question. Does Iran have any incentive whatsoever to trust the U.S. in negotiations?
Okay, great. One more right here. Hand is held high. Just be Tria. You are right. Yeah.
I'm John DeBluzio, board member. Great to have you, Rachel and Bob here, and Ali as well. So there's 3 civil wars in the region in the Levant that are ending right now, or have the chance to end. In Iran, because of Iranian influence waning, Iraq's civil war, which started in 2004, Lebanon's civil war, which started in 1975 and should have ended at Taif in 89 and didn't because Hezbollah was allowed to keep their weapons, and in Syria, which started with the Arab Spring. All of this is an opportunity, and I'd like to hear from Ali in particular, with the waning influence of Iran, what can happen in these republics? What do you see as the opportunity for the United States to reorient if these republics are able to become stable democracies?
Can I ask you each to only take one of the questions? You can choose which, but
Ali
Ali, I
can
think
take
you,
all three.
you don't really get to choose because. So I'll let you go first, Ali.
It's a very interesting question. Because in all of the cases that you mentioned, the state institutions still remain pretty weak. And Iran's expertise is in exploiting chaos and instability. It's not very good at building stuff, but it's very good at exploiting chaos. And so there is still space, even in Syria, where Iran has lost all of its influence at the moment, to eventually try to regain some influence if things move in the wrong direction. And what do I mean by things moving in the wrong direction? For instance, I think we've done the right thing of providing sanctions relief for Syria. However, Syria is also a case study of what it means if you adopt a reconciliatory position towards Israel, right? They even were thinking about normalizing relations with Israel, but they're being bombed with Israel. I mean, there was regime change in Syria, they were bombed. Then there was reconciliatory notes from the new Syrian leader. It didn't matter, Israel is still bombing them, right? So, and then there are examples of Jordan and Egypt as well, the first two Arab countries that normalized with Israel, and look at their situation. They're not democracies. The president calls the leader of Egypt my favorite dictator, right? I mean, I think he has more favorite dictators these days, but in any case, it's just a stunning thing that unlike post-World War II, where we actually tried building democracies in Japan, in Germany, there is no such an effort in the region, right? And in order to do that, you need investment, you need to push for democratic institutions, you need to support civil society, and we've dismantled all the infrastructure that we have to do all of that, right? So I'm not very hopeful that we would actually, at state building, as good as Iran is at exploiting and dismantling state, we're also not very good at state building. So I'm not very hopeful that we can use this opportunity. However, I do believe, and as unrealistic as that might sound, this is actually a moment of opportunity to change the nature of our relationship with Iran, because Iran is in a position of weakness. And if we are to pursue non-zero-sum agreements, I think there will be a way out that would then stabilize the entire region and would turn Iran into a positive rather than a negative force.
Thank you. That is tremendously probably right, but also very optimistic. It's heading in the direction that we all need to be heading if we want to see change. But man, that's a tall order.
So let me say a little bit more about regime change, because I think it's important to be careful what you wish for, because you may get it. So right now, I am sure on President Trump's desk somewhere, there are the plans to actually kill the supreme leader. You've heard him talk about it, and then go several levels down, probably the council, probably multiple levels down in Iran. And we have lots of ability to kill overnight hundreds and hundreds of leaders in Iran. We know their homes, we know their families. This would be sort of an effort to take out, say, the top, maybe not all 4,000 as we did, as Israel did with Hezbollah, but let's say close to 800 leaders within, say, a 48-hour period. We would have that capability to do that. Israel not, but the United States has that power, and we could do that almost as a bolt from the blue. Now, let's assume that we actually do that. Well, the thing you have to remember is, well, you say, well, gee, we did that with Hezbollah. Wasn't that wonderful? Well, Hezbollah didn't have the 408 kilograms. They did not have lots and lots of missile capability. They did not have, I'm sorry to say, lots and lots of chemical and biological capability here that can be developed either in short order. In other words, we would have a massive loose nuke problem. We had that problem. We worried about that in Russia when the regime in Russia collapsed. But we had our own a sort of friendly replacement right there. And notice we did not bomb the Soviet regime into obliteration. We let it happen, and then we worked with the new government to sew up the loose nuke problem. This is going to be a wickedly dangerous world, not just for a month or so, but for years, if in fact we truly crush that regime. So when I'm talking about the possible problems with regime change, I don't mean that we can't crush the current regime. I mean the idea that we're replacing that with basically someone who's going to be subservient to Israel or the United States in anything like the next 4, 5, 10 years, I think is highly unlikely. And there's going to be a lot of negative consequences in the interim. So this is really the risks that we face going forward. I don't know what the arguments are coming at President Trump. I hope some of the folks in Washington are watching this, because this is what they need to hear. The PowerPoint presentation is there, folks. You will see they can guarantee 90+% killing of those top 1,000 leaders. The problem is the next stages that I just discussed.
Thank you. Rachel?
Well, I think on regime change, the Israeli war plans weren't calling for regime change. I think they became quite confident and had, with the hubris of having complete air superiority, and there were some who were beginning to speak of it. But let's remember, it was President Trump who pulled them back. I don't think the president is looking at this moment for regime change. I think the question Marilyn's asking around regime change is whether this kind of instability and this kind of destruction somehow loosens the ties within Iran itself, making it more unstable, that would lead to some sort of collapse of the regime. And I think it's a fair question. My takeaway from that is both from you, Bob, is that air power doesn't do that, but also from studying the region, particularly Saudi Arabia and others, that was always the question: will the regime fall? Will the regime fall? The Iranian regime is a well-structured regime, and there's succession plans there, and there's a tightening of that as the supreme leader gets older. I think where the United States, we should rarely assume that the regime is going to fall, because the evidence isn't really there. And so the question should be, which I would agree with both of you on this, is where the U.S. is really falling down on this. It wasn't the response itself, which I think was strategically smart, but it's more that there is not a diplomatic plan to follow. We don't have anything that is motivating those in Iran who might be considering some sort of deal to sign up for it, to change course. We are not good at that, and we're not good at this right now in the region with this particular administration in DC. And that's, I would say, pretty tragic, because I agree, Ali, with you, is that Iran is so weak, and sophisticated diplomats would be finding ways to have them save face and maybe make the decision we would like them to, which is to kind of cool it on their enrichment towards a bomb, because the evidence shows it is not working for them. It is so costly. And I don't think we have that. And so while I do think it was militarily successful, it was diplomatically pointless, because we're not coming in with the strategy, and we don't have we're not deploying our diplomats who might be able to make a difference.
Thank you. We're going to take a couple really quick questions. You're going to get very short answers because we're right at the end. But the right here, Porter, the woman in the middle, and then somebody right back here, maybe those two.
Oh, Leslie, it's a graduate
I
student
just
friend
noticed
from
Mia Bloom.
Columbia.
Just Jack, and we can have a reunion.
Mia
so
Bloom in
hi.
the house.
I'm Mia Bloom. So quick question. It seems that we have a dichotomy of a plethora of intelligence, that Israel is on the cutting edge, and then October 7th. So how do you reconcile, and maybe this is for Bob or for Ali, but how do you reconcile the fact that Israel has this amazing intelligence where they can take out IRCG and Hamas leadership and Hezbollah in what I like to call the Nakbib. And then at the same time, they missed completely all the advanced warnings about October 7th.
Thank you. Great question. Porter, I'm going to let you choose because you know the audience so much better than I do. Perfect. Go for it. Tria, thank you.
Thank you for everything. This is Summer, and I just graduated from U Chicago in public policy.
Congratulations.
And thank you so much. So the reason why I'm mentioning all this, another thing, I'm Persian, and my parents spent 18 years in the government's prisons. So you all mentioned that there is no alternative, and then there is no regime change. Could you please, just like coming from the U Chicago background that I have, and we really care about resources, could you please share where you get these conclusions from? Thank you.
Thank you very much. A quick comment here, and then you're just going to get one line each. I'm really super sorry. It's going to be unsatisfying, but you can find the speakers afterwards.
Thank you all very much. It was a lovely presentation. I think the consensus was that there was a successful military campaign of brief objectives, but no political plan to follow. I'm persuaded by Ali's comments about the primacy of narratives around this, as well as the question of the true objectives of this campaign and what was accomplished. I would just question, what was the objective and how does this exist in a broader context in the region? We haven't talked about Gaza at all or about the overlap of this. And I direct objectives there.
I want to say something about this, okay? Because I think we all understand, and I know, and I am very glad that you raised it. We are not here to ignore what's going on in Gaza. In fact, tomorrow morning we have a podcast on exactly this topic. We will be having events to touch the very serious crisis and war in that part of the region. So thank you for raising it. But I just want to say that because I understand that many people will be sitting here thinking, come on, why are you not talking about that? So we will. And so please keep coming back. This is just a beginning. And one of the things that would be great to hear from people in the days ahead is, the other things that you'd like to hear about. So very quickly on the kind of topic of the panel, this is your closing comment because we're totally at time. And I grew up in an institution where we stopped on time. So I'm now breaking the other Chatham House rule. Rachel, you get to go first.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the student whose parents have been fighting for regime change and how disheartening it must be for us to be up here saying that that we can't change it. This kind of attack won't change the regime, and I don't think there is belief that it could, but we want to kind of make sure that it's clear that this isn't going to do it, and that it has to come. The change in regime will come when there's different incentives for those in Iran to choose a different path. There's things we can do to help and nudge it along. But ultimately, the point I wanted to make was that to assume that that because the regime didn't fall, it wasn't a successful campaign. I want to nip that in the bud. And also to acknowledge that if anyone was hoping it would, it still could, but it's unlikely. It would be surprising. But kudos to your family, and I'm sorry that you're all going through that and they weren't more successful.
Ali, I'm going to come to you next. I think we have to start with Chicago and end with Chicago. So you get to go in the middle.
I will also address the regime change question, and it will be hard to prove a negative, right? The problem with the opposition abroad is that they're fighting one another, not really fighting the regime as much, and the opposition inside the country is in jail. So that's why I'm saying there is no organized, disciplined opposition with a positive vision. Some would support the Shah's son, some would support others, and they would fight one another rather than focusing on the regime. And the last point here is that, at the end of the day, regime change is going to happen, because this is why I was saying that the US can play a positive role if it had a strategy, if it had a vision, because the Supreme Leader is 86. So we are, there's just by the force of nature, a change is going to happen soon. The question is, and by nature, he is more likely to pursue Saddam's path post 1991 rather than Sadat in 1979, meaning that he's going to double down. So what's going to happen if we continue to isolate this country, put pressure on it, is that the same thing that happened in Iraq. The fabric of the society will be torn apart. So even when the regime is removed forcefully or in whatever way or collapses, implodes, you still will not get what you and I, as people who were originally from Iran, would want to see, which is a better future for that country and the region.
I want to close by saying that, as I told you, I'm a big supporter of Israel. I want Israel to be here 5 years from now, 10 years from now. My biggest concern is right now, Israel is engaged in 5 conflicts. It's engaged in conflict with the Palestinians, southern Lebanon, Syria, the Houthis, and now Iran. Israel is 7 million people, 7 million Jews, and they are now up against hundreds of millions. Now, this is a major challenge, and I think that the fact that we still don't know why Israel allowed the biggest intelligence failure in its history to happen on October 7 makes these grand strategic problems worse. So I'm not telling you it is easy, but I do think we need to talk seriously about how is a country of 7 million people truly going to win 5 wars where you just saw President Trump said, we're in for a day and then we're out. How is Israel really going to do this and ignore that why that huge intelligence failure occurred? This is really the central question for Israel's future, and it's the one that I hope we can get an answer to.
There's so much in there. This was a tremendous panel. This is a tremendous audience. This is a very different audience than what I'm used to. You like to smile and laugh. It's even in really tough conversations. I think that's a sign of, I don't know, hope and energy and something really great happening in Chicago. But please join me in thanking these 3 people.